While he was in prison, awaiting his execution, John Brown wrote his will. He gave his son Jason his watch, and his son Owen his opera glasses and his rifle. And he left each of his children a Bible. After his death, his wife Mary came to collect his body, but she was forced to pay the fee for his execution before she was allowed to take it home. His rifle, his glasses, his watch, his Bible, his wife, his body. This film is for my son. In 1851, John Brown met Frederick Douglass in Detroit. He pointed at the Allegheny Mountains and said, "This is our place." Brown planned to arm a militia of men who would forcibly free those who were enslaved on plantations. Some of those freed would remain with Brown in the mountains, creating a kind of autonomous state, while others would be escorted north to Canada, under protection from an armed guard. It was in Frederick Douglass's house that John Brown wrote his provisional constitution, a document that Brown's lawyers would later use against his wishes, in an attempt to prove that John Brown was insane. This is Belle Isle in Detroit, the site of the 1943 riot here, which broke out after a white man believed his girlfriend had been insulted by a black man. The riot lasted over 3 days and 30 people were killed. 25 of them were black. 17 of those were killed by the police. Houses in Detroit, which once housed over 10,000 people. They were built in 1935, and they closed permanently in 2008. In 1967, the Kerner Commission notoriously spoke of the United States as two distinct societies, separate and unequal. It said, certain fundamental matters are clear. Of these, the most fundamental is the racial attitude of white Americans towards black Americans. Race prejudice has shaped our history decisively. White racism is essentially responsible for the explosive mixture which has been accumulating in cities since the end of World War II.
So the objective of talking about racism and white supremacy is not for the purpose of dogging the people who have white skin. No, it is to replace the system of racism, white supremacy, which is the highest form of terrorism and the highest form of injustice, to replace it with a system of justice.
There's a Frederick Douglass story I remember reading. It said that Ida Wells had sent Douglass a telegram from the South, trying to prevent the lynching of a young man. And so Frederick Douglass set off for the newspaper. But since he refused to ride the segregated streetcars in Detroit, he walked. And by the time he arrived there, they already had news that the lynching had occurred. So then Frederick Douglass turned around and walked back home. My partner grew up in Virginia, not that far from where Nat Turner's insurrection occurred. And he remembers his father taking him there when he was a kid. When we went driving in the area one day, he was able to find the gravesite of one of his aunts in the cemetery of a nearby church. When I went back alone a few days later to do some filming, I met a man here in the town. He asked me if I was from the area, and I said no, but my partner was. And when he asked his name, he said he might be related to him. And it's possible he is somehow. But the man in the town was white, like I am. And my partner and his family are black. They descend from people that were enslaved on plantations nearby. But I don't really know what that man meant. Not in the way that I knew exactly what my mother's friends meant when they first saw my son and said that one couldn't even tell he had a black father, as if it was a compliment. In 1831, Nat Turner led a rebellion of over 100 freed and enslaved men down a road in Southampton, Virginia. They killed more than 60 plantation owners and their families. It was said that there was an eclipse the night of the revolt, that it was a night so dark that one could barely see. and it was said that as they walked, the men whistled to call their collaborators out to join them. After the rebellion, Turner was able to hide out for more than 3 weeks until he was discovered and then executed. It's said that after he was cut down, his skin was removed from his body and sold as souvenirs. A few years ago, there was a movement to place a plaque at the cave where Turner had hidden, but people opposed it, calling Nat Turner a terrorist. In Richmond, there is a plaque to Gabriel Prosser's rebellion, one of the first slave rebellions in the area. But the actual site is now down underneath the highway overpass. The highway also marks the site of the field where slave auctions were once held. And stored in the corner of a nearby parking lot is the original slave jail, where those who were captured escaping enslavement were held before they were returned to those who owned them. John Brown was raised in Hudson, Ohio, the fourth son of Owen Brown, an evangelical preacher. Brown himself went to seminary to train as a preacher. But when he was forced to leave due to illness, he went to work for his father in a local tannery. At the age of 25, Brown married, and he moved to Pennsylvania to start his own tannery, and there he had the first of his children. But within 10 years, his business had failed, and his wife and 2 of his children had died. Brown moved back to Franklin, Ohio. He remarried and began another tannery. He had 9 more children, but by the age of 40, he was forced to declare bankruptcy. That same year, 4 of his children died in a single week, in a bout of dysentery that almost killed Brown himself. By 1846, Brown had moved to the abolitionist stronghold of Springfield, Massachusetts. And it was in Springfield that Brown's views galvanized. Frederick Douglass and John Brown first met in Springfield in 1847. And Douglass later said of Brown that though he's a white man, he's in sympathy with the black man as though his own soul had been pierced with the iron of slavery. Douglass and Brown spent an evening talking, and Douglass would later write of this evening by saying, "From this night I spent with John Brown in 1847. While I continued to write and speak about slavery, I became all the less hopeful for its peaceful abolition." In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Law, which allowed for those escaping enslavement to be pursued into free states. It set up slave patrols to pursue those escaped, which were in many ways the beginning of our modern law enforcement. The law forced cooperation with these patrols, making it a crime to prevent the recapture of an escaped slave. This compromise of 1850 also opened up the western states to slavery. And by 1854, John Brown had sent 5 of his sons to Kansas to fight for it to enter the Union as a free state. By that March, 5,000 armed pro-slavery men, who became known as the Border Ruffians, marched into Kansas from Missouri, intent on making Kansas a slave state. They seized all of the polling places and set up armed encampments. John Brown's eldest son, also named John, wrote an urgent letter to his father, asking for weapons. And John Brown left immediately to join his sons. In May, the Border Ruffians sacked the Free State capital of Lawrence, Kansas, destroying the town. And it was said that John Brown went into the woods and he prayed. And that when he returned, he gathered 20 men, including 3 of his youngest sons, and led them to the pro-slavery house of William Sherman. There, he pulled all of the men out of the house, and he ordered his followers to cut them down with swords. And then John Brown shot William Sherman in the head. Brown and his men then rode on to 2 more farmhouses, and at each, they again ordered the men from the houses. They led them down to the river, cut off their heads with swords. They cut the bodies to pieces and left them behind in the water. Brown's eldest sons, Jason and John, had refused to accompany him. But when they heard what happened, they rode out to find their father. They were captured. Jason was released within a few days, but the younger John Brown was held for almost 3 months. It is said that his imprisonment drove him nearly insane. And even years later, his father would write to people by saying, "I asked for help for my son, who was greatly undone by the violence in Kansas." In 1845, the radical abolitionist Lysander Spooner wrote a pamphlet entitled "The Unconstitutionality of American Slavery." It said that the very idea of law originates in man's natural rights, that there can be no other standard other than natural rights by which civil law can be measured, that it is only those who have a false and superstitious reverence for the authority of government who will have any doubt as to the rights of slaves to make war upon the property of the slaveholder. This is Chicago, where my partner and I have lived off and on for more than 20 years. This is where our son was born. And this is where my stepdaughter still lives. The summer that we moved away, the city closed more than 70 public schools, mostly in poor or black neighborhoods. This year, they again cut the public school budget by up to 30%. And when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was hit with a rock here while leading an integration rally, he said, of all the places he'd ever been, he'd never seen a place as full of hatred as Chicago.
So you say you're gonna preach this week? What was that title again?
I try to tell you.
I tried to tell you. There it is, ladies and gentlemen.
All right.
That's good English right there, man. I like that.
I love you.
Love you back, bro.
This is the 29th Street Beach, which was the site of the 1919 race riot here. be gone after a black youth swam over the invisible line dividing the black beach from the white, crossing the color barrier, and then was stoned to death by an angry crowd. Chicago is a center of what some might call elegant racism. A history of housing discrimination and unfair lending, of housing covenants, and riots when black people tried to move into white neighborhoods. The Cicero riot occurred when Harvey Clark attempted to move his family into the all-white suburb of Cicero, Illinois. They tried to move in the afternoon, hoping to avoid conflict. So the riot was begun by a crowd of women, pushing strollers as they threw rocks. By the evening, a crowd of 4,000 whites had formed. They overturned police cars and firebombed buildings. 119 people were arrested, but charges weren't pressed against any of them. Eventually, the only person convicted of a crime was the landlady, who had leased the apartment to Harvey Clark in the first place. Sometimes when I drive through this neighborhood, I see businesses that have clearly been around since before the 1940s. And I wonder what they did during the housing riots. In the same way that a colleague, a filmmaker from Virginia, sometimes wonders when he's in historical buildings in the South if they've been partially built by enslaved children. Sun Ra's Saturn Records was located on Wabash Avenue, not that far from the South Side home of Emmett Till's mother, Mamie, who had sent her son out of the city south for the summer to visit his cousins, only to be forced to ship his body back home. And when she laid him out in this church, she did so with the casket open, so that people would see what had been done to her son.
Open it. Press this.
And then lift.
Can you start it? Okay.
I don't know what it's like to lose a child.
Mama.
When my son was born, I'd have these dreams, where his room would fill with water and he'd drown. I'd walk into his room in the morning and I'd be afraid he'd no longer be there.
Tell me what you're doing.
When Tracy Fulton heard the jury's verdict acquitting George Zimmerman for murdering his son, Trayvon Martin, he said he couldn't believe it. He said they didn't see him as my son. They didn't see him as a teenager. They didn't see him as a human being.
Go. Go.
And what I find most haunting about Mike Brown's murder is not just that the policeman described him as looking like a demon, but the fact that his body was allowed to lie in the street for well over 4 hours.
Above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky.
And then there's this video of 12-year-old Tamir Rice playing in a park, taken just moments before he's shot and killed by the Cleveland police.
give the Negro any land. Through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farm. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. This is what we are faced with, and this is a reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
There's a film that my partner, who's a musician, really likes, called Jackie McLean on Mars. And in it, McLean's teaching his students in Hartford when one of them asks about Sun Ra, saying, "I really like the music. Why they gotta dress up like that? Why they gotta walk around and act like kings?"
When he'd walk out, like, you know, they'd have a big setup, and he had a lot of musicians, and they were playing good rhythms, and he'd come walk out, like walk up and down in front of everybody, like smiling like he's a king or something like that.
Again, man, can he be a god and a king? The man's 60, been out here starving all these years. Can he be a god and a king? Can he be, man? Let him be.
In 1967, a few days after the Newark riots started, a fight broke out here in the White Star restaurant in Plainfield, New Jersey. The fight escalated until it bled out into the nearby neighborhood. The nearby riots in Newark had started after a black taxi driver named John Schmitt was arrested for driving around 2 double-parked police cars. His arrest happened across from the Hayes Home housing project. And when he was severely beaten by the police as he was taken into custody, a crowd formed. Two days later, this arms manufacturer in Middlesex, New Jersey was broken into, and over 100 semi-automatic weapons were stolen. The National Guard was called, and they went house to house without warrants, searching the black neighborhoods here. But nothing was recovered. It was a Plainsfield carbine Angela Davis bought in 1969, the one that was later used by Jonathan Jackson in an attempt to free his brother George Jackson from prison. George Jackson, who wrote a letter to his father after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, saying that the concept of nonviolence was a false idea, that it presupposed a sense of compassion and a sense of justice on the part of one's adversary. An adversary that had everything to lose and nothing to gain by exercising justice and compassion. Epton was alleged to have made these statements at an organizational meeting held after off-duty police officer Thomas Gilligan had shot and killed 14-year-old James Powell. Gilligan later claimed that Powell had lunged at him with a knife, but no knife was ever found at the scene. At the time of his death, Powell had been in the 8th grade. He was 5'6", and he weighed 120 pounds. Famously, John Brown said, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land can never be purged away but with blood." John Brown's favorite book was Fox's Book of Martyrs, which detailed the persecutions that the Protestants suffered under the Catholic Church, the tortures to the body for the preservation of faith. In a letter he wrote just before his execution, Brown said, "I believe that to have interfered as I have done on the behalf of his despised poor is no wrong, but right. If it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood with the blood of millions in this slave country, then I say, let it be done." By 1857, John Brown was in Iowa training his militia. He hired a man called Colonel Forbes, who had fought with Garibaldi and written a book on guerrilla warfare. After a few months training with Brown, Forbes asked Brown for more money, and when he was refused, he threatened to reveal Brown's plans and supporters, many of whom preferred to remain anonymous. Worried at being exposed, Brown's supporters urged him to wait, and he lost almost a year in planning. During that time, 2 of the free black supporters of Brown joined the colonization plan, leaving the United States to live in the newly formed colony of Liberia. Colonization, an odd alliance between black religious leaders and conservative slave owners, neither of whom believed that blacks and whites could live at peace together in the United States. Even as late as 1862, President Lincoln was still contemplating a compromise with slave owners, one that would compensate Southern slave owners for the cost of the loss of their slave property, and promised to repatriate those who were freed to a site outside the United States. By 1859, John Brown had come to this house in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And it was here in this house that Frederick Douglass met John Brown for the last time. John Brown asked Douglass to accompany him on the raid to Harper's Ferry, but Douglass refused. Brown told Douglass, "When I strike, the bees will begin to swarm, and I'll need you to hive them." Douglass had traveled accompanied by his friend and servant Shields Green, who had escaped enslavement years before. In the morning, Frederick Douglass prepared to leave, but Shields Green decided to remain with Brown, telling Douglass, "I believe I'll stay with the old man." By October, John Brown and his men were here in this house. John Brown living under the assumed name Isaac Smith. They lived here for 3 months, as John Brown attempted to gather the members of his provisional army back to him. On October 16th, John Brown walked the long road to Harper's Ferry. He and his men walked through the night, cutting the telegram lines and stopping a train, before eventually barricading themselves inside the armory. By the next day, they were surrounded. Ten of Brown's men were killed outright, including 2 of his sons. John Brown and 7 others were captured, tried, and then eventually executed. Once John Brown's wife was finally allowed to take his body away, she brought it back here to his home in North Elba, New York. She had to use a series of decoys and travel in secret in order to get it there unmolested, avoiding those who would otherwise have desecrated it. She buried it on land that was part of a settlement called Timbuktu, a cooperative of freed blacks where Brown had built his home. It was a place that John Brown had called a paradise, though he'd rarely had the chance to actually live there. When John Brown died, church bells were rung all over the North. The song John Brown's Body became an anthem of the Union Army and was so ubiquitous that when W.E.B. Du Bois visited China in 1953, a marching band greeted him with the tune. "21 men followed John Brown to Harper's Ferry. 6 of these were black. Of them, only Osborne Anderson survived the raid, going on to fight in the Union Army. Shields Green was executed on December 16, 1859, just 2 weeks after John Brown's own death. Executed with him was 25-year-old John Copeland, a freed black man who had joined with Brown years before. Before his execution, Copeland wrote a letter to his own family, in which he said, "Dear ones, he who writes this will in a few hours be in this world no longer. The last Sabbath with me on earth has passed away. The last Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday that I shall ever see on this earth have been passed by God's glorious Son, which he has placed in the heavens to illuminate this earth. If it were not that I know your hearts will be filled with sorrow at my fate, I could pass from this earth without regrets. Why should you sorrow? Have I not everything to gain and nothing to lose by this change? I'm only leaving a world filled with sorrow and woe, to enter one in which there's nothing but one lasting day of happiness and bliss." After Copeland and Green were hung, their bodies were cut down and buried, only to be exhumed and sold to a local medical college as teaching cadavers. When Copeland's family went to the college to recover their son's body, they were unable to find it. They did see the body of Shields Green, but they were forbidden to take it away to bury. In 1881, Frederick Douglass gave a speech on the anniversary of John Brown's death, in which he said, "If there is a memorial to John Brown, then Shields Green's name should be prominent upon it."
Abraham, Abraham, have mercy on my soul. And if I'm tormented in these flames, send Lazarus down here that he might dip his finger in cool water and cool my parching tongue, because I'm tormented in flame. But if he can't send him here, send him down yonder and tell my 5 brothers, don't come down here in hell. He opened up a prayer meeting in hell. He prayed, but his prayer was too late. He called on God, but he called too late. Oh, sinner, don't wait until it's too late to call on God. If you call God in time, he will hear and answer your prayer. Won't he do it, children? Didn't he hear you a long time ago? He heard me a long time ago. Amen.
Within a few years of John Brown's death, his wife Mary and his remaining children moved west to California. His son Owen and his daughter Ruth settled here. Ruth with her husband Henry Thompson, and they lived in the hills above the town of Altadena, which is where I now live with my family. We moved here 3 years ago, in part because of the town's African-American population, which itself is in part a residue of the extreme segregationist policies of nearby Pasadena, which bitterly fought integration of its schools, even after it was mandated by a federal court in 1969. Altadena is also the childhood home of Rodney King, whose brutal beating at the hands of 4 Los Angeles police officers was famously videotaped by an onlooker from a nearby building. It was the failure of a Simi Valley jury to prosecute those officers that set off the unrest that is now known as the LA riots. The lot where King was beaten is across the street from the Hanson Dam Recreational Center, which is now where we sometimes take our son to go swimming.
Is the system working or not? No, it's so obvious. It's so obvious that it's not working.
Can I say something? I want working like South Africa. That's how it's working. You know what? South Africa, for all the Crips and Bloods to unite and stand together. And we're stand together, fuck the white man.
Thank you.